So again, my name is Mayra Puente. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at UC Santa Barbara. I'm in my third year now. Prior to that, I earned my PhD in education at UC San Diego. And before that, I earned my bachelor's degree at UCLA. And yeah, very honored to be one of the postdoctoral fellows that was chosen this year. And thank you so much for the land acknowledgement as well, Sandy. Sitting on the Chumash land is also where UCSB is located, so thankful for those folks that have taken care of our land. And so today I want to share a little bit about the progress of my research under this fellowship, which, as Diane mentioned, has given me the liberty to focus on research, right, and to, especially now with everything that's happening under the Trump administration, to really focus on the experiences of students that are coming from immigrant and migrant families that are being targeted and affected by Trump. So it was perfect timing, I think, almost kismet to receive this fellowship at this time. And so I'm halfway through the fellowship, so I'm still conducting research, collecting and analyzing data, but I'll share a little bit about who I am, why I came to this work, and the status of the project so far. That focuses on students that are Latina, Latino, Latinx, right? We use the X to be gender neutral and be inclusive of different gendered identities for students that come from Latin American backgrounds. And I specifically look at students that come from rural, migrant, farm working backgrounds, which is a background that I have myself that I'll share a little bit about. And thinking about how they access higher education, how they come to choose different colleges, what motivates these decisions, and how, of course, we can improve higher education access, equity, and success for these students. And now that I am a professor here at UCSB, thinking about what this looks like in the Central Coast region. So as I mentioned, I am a proud daughter of Mexican migrant farm workers. I grew up as a young child working with my parents as well in the agricultural fields, picking a lot of our citrus fruits. Where I'm from in East Porterville, California, we have a lot of oranges and lemons, and that's really what we're known for. Our town flag has oranges on it. And so the Central Valley, right, the San Joaquin Valley is all agricultural, as we know, and we're one of the top producers, right, of our nation's foods, and we often don't talk about the people that pick those crops, right, that have fed us today, right? We saw a lot of great fruits on our tables, so I just want to honor people like my parents, farm workers throughout California, throughout the nation. And as I mentioned, I'm from this small community called East Porterville. It's an hour north of Bakersfield, which is sort of the bigger city that I often reference because people don't really know where Porterville is. And there's a lot of these small communities throughout the Central Valley agricultural region. And growing up in this community, I didn't understand at the time when I was a young child that the reason people like my parents and surrounding neighbors and family members, the reason that we relied on wells for water, the reason that we did not have street lights or sidewalks, the reason that we had dirt roads was because it was an unincorporated community, right? We don't have access to a lot of city resources. And so the small town has a population of about 5,000, mostly Latinx, right? 86% of the population there, and they are mostly Mexican. 35% are immigrants, 43% live in poverty, and 53% have a high school diploma, but only 3% of the people that live in this small town have a bachelor's degree. And so when I was growing up, I always wondered why that was, right? Why people like me, why people like my parents, my community members, why did we not have access to higher education? Why did most of us, as you can see here, right, 53%, when we did graduate from high school, why didn't we often follow the footsteps of our parents and also work in the fields when we knew it was really backbreaking, difficult, arduous labor that of course doesn't result in much pay, right, or benefits. And I was one of two people from my senior class at that time. We had a senior class of about 100 students who was admitted to UCLA. And so of course all my teachers and counselors were super proud and were pushing me to go to this institution because it is one of the top public higher education institutions in California and the nation as well. And so they were pushing me to go to this institution. But I think what they didn't know is that being from this migrant farm working background, right, I had never left my small town of East Porterville. I grew up there for 18 years and had never really traveled outside of it, besides like the neighboring communities where we would migrate with the crops to pick agricultural products. But I had never really traveled a significant distance, let alone lived far away from my parents. And so for me, it caused these issues of how am I going to get there, right? At the time as well, undocumented immigrants in California didn't have access to getting a driver's license, which of course that changed and they're now able to get one. So my parents wouldn't drive outside of our small community either. So it posed these issues of distance, geographic isolation. I had to figure out how to work Amtrak and learn to do that by myself. And so it caused a lot of fear in my parents, right? Specifically my mom wondering what was going to happen to me if I left this small town and entered a big city. And I also wondered, what if I miss my family, right? My parents were a very tight-knit community as well, being from a rural community. And I wondered, as a young woman, right, as the oldest in my family, who was gonna take over these familial responsibilities that I had in terms of taking care of my younger siblings, doing some of the household chores, also just translating for my parents, right, helping them with legal, medical documents, all of these things that we know often come with being the oldest in your family. And I had some sort of guilt. My teachers and counselors were extremely proud of me, but I was often embarrassed to share that I was leaving Porterville to go to UCLA because I felt like I was leaving everybody behind. Students that I had grown up with, right, my peers, that we had been together since kinder. We were 5 years old and had known each other all throughout high school. So for me, it was also sad to leave them. And I also wondered, right, what is it gonna be like to live in LA, to live in this huge metropolitan urban place? Was I gonna like it? How were the people gonna be there? And it was in leaving my community and attending UCLA and living in this urban place for 4 years, and then later San Diego and now Santa Barbara, right? It's been me traversing these different contexts that are mostly affluent places, right, as we know, that led to this rural awareness and identity that I didn't know that I had, because everybody in my town, all of us were children of migrant farm working parents. And so it didn't really dawn on me that I did have this rural working class poor background until I was at UCLA. And so that compelled me and a couple of other students who were also Latino, who were attending UCLA as undergraduate students, to start an organization at UCLA, because most of the outreach at UCLA by students or by faculty tends to cater to the urban communities, right? Which makes sense. That institution in LA is meant to serve surrounding communities. And of course, right, there are also working class Latinx students and families that live in Los Angeles. But I often wonder, why are institutions like UCLA doing outreach to the San Joaquin Valley, right? Maybe then more students like myself would be wanting to come to a place like UCLA. And so a couple of us started this organization called the Central Valley Project. It was started in 2012, and it is still running to this day. So each year it's a different set of students that take over. And so I'm really proud to have been one of the initial founders of this organization, in which we would go back to different communities like mine, Porterville, also Lindsay, Madera. We did a little bit of outreach in Delano. So just these small communities as well that needed these college-related resources. And we would travel on this bi-weekly basis as students. We would fundraise to be able to rent vans to then drive the UCLA undergraduate students who were the mentors to these different high school sites. And then from 9 to 2 p.m. we would run these workshops as you see here, where we would work with other students that were also Latino background, migrant from working background, low-income background, in which we would talk to them about higher education, right? And talk to them about the differences between a community college, a CSU, a UC, privates, and just give them any type of information and help that we had access to as students. Often read it through their college applications, helping them apply to scholarships. We would also fundraise to give out scholarships ourselves. And one of the events that I also helped to coordinate annually was this family event, right? Because when I told my mom that I was going to UCLA and that I was admitted, her immediate response was no. And it was coming more so from this fear of like, how are you going to get there? What am I going to do without you? And all this familial separation that was going to happen. It wasn't necessarily because she didn't want me to go into higher education, right? I think she was just afraid of all of the unknown. And so having experienced that relationship with my own mother, it caused me to create these family events where I said, okay, if we're going to be talking to the high school students, we also need to be engaging their parents, their extended family members, and creating this sort of college-going culture within our families as well. To talk to them and just answer their questions, right? Any fears that they might have, hopefully we can lessen them by sharing our own experiences. And we would also bring our own parents to talk to the other parents. And just, it was just really these beautiful gatherings and events that we would have, and we would take the students on university field trips as well. Of course, right, because as I mentioned, being geographically isolated, coming from these working class, poor, low-income backgrounds, students often don't have money or the time to be traveling to universities, and so we would fundraise to rent a charter bus and then take the students that were in our program. This is from the Porterville site. There's about 20 students that would come, and we took them to UC Santa Barbara. And that was my first time as well, being at UC Santa Barbara. And so having access to these types of college tours and field trips really then motivated them, right, to apply to these institutions that otherwise they probably would not have considered because they didn't know about them or they were just unfamiliar with these faraway institutions. And so after finishing my UCLA undergraduate education, thinking about the issues that I had experienced and then also the issues that I was seeing with the other students who shared my backgrounds, and then really understanding that these were not just issues that were affecting me, right, but they were affecting a lot of students and families within my community and across different communities in the San Joaquin Valley. I decided to continue researching these issues at UC San Diego, where I earned my PhD, and to continue to think about issues of rurality, specifically rural Latinx identity, what it means to come from a migrant from working background, what it means to be geographically isolated, to not have access to college-related resources, information, and guidance. And I was able to conduct my research there. And I went back and I did it in my hometown with students who shared my identities. Many of these students that were a part of my study, I had actually gone to school with their older siblings, or some students were my neighbors, right, where my parents still continue to live. So it was really this beautiful study that I conducted with students from my community. And now being an assistant professor at UCSB, right, I started to think a lot about my responsibility and role in being a professor at Santa Barbara, and what that meant in terms of doing outreach, not just to the San Joaquin Valley where I'm from, but also the Central Coast, right, because this is the region, the communities that an institution like UCSB is intended to serve. And so I'm very honored to be a recipient to continue thinking about this work on college accessibility, issues of geography, of distance, and how that's affecting students from rural Latinx, migrant, from working backgrounds. And as I mentioned, right, I was thinking about my role here at UCSB, and also noting that there are large Latinx populations, right, in these counties, in the Central Coast. And for low-income Latinx folks, a lot of the jobs that they have here, right, also in this agricultural region and in smaller communities, is doing field work, right? And so I was very much reminded of my own hometown as I got to know and understand the different communities that live here and the type of work that they do and the contributions that they make to our region and the nation at large. And as I was connecting and also getting to know my colleagues at UCSB, a lot of them do a lot of outreach and connection with local Santa Barbara schools, right? Which of course makes sense for both the districts, the students, the families, and the faculty involved in this type of outreach. It makes sense to outreach to our neighboring schools and communities. And there are also some faculty that do work like in the Santa Maria and Lompoc areas, which is really important too. And so with me being new, I started to think about, okay, where are places that UCSB still needs to serve? Who do we still need to do outreach with? And here is just this general map that I was looking at when I was thinking about this project of the Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And you can see that there's a diversity of different types of communities, right, including cities, suburban areas, and small towns. And so I was very much interested in those small towns that we can already see are very geographically isolated from the cities or near the mountainous area, and just very far away. And as I was connecting with my colleagues and doctoral students, they were like, yeah, we don't go over there. We don't do research in that area. It's too far, it's inaccessible. And for me, as somebody who has lived in this geographically isolated community, who never had college recruiters or researchers, or because I believe, right, college recruiters and researchers are a type of college knowledge and resources, right, that we need in these areas. So I thought, okay, let me be the first to try to start this project and to start developing these relationships with those small town communities in that area, which then led me to establish a relationship with the community of Fillmore, which is a small town of 17,000 people, a lot more than my small town of 5,000 people in Porterville, but they were also mostly Latinx, right? 21% are immigrants, 5% live in poverty, so I thought that that was interesting. There was less poverty in this community than in my hometown of Porterville. 78% have a high school diploma, but only 15% have a bachelor's degree. So again, we're starting to see these trends of the young people that are going to that live in these communities are graduating from high school, right? And that tends to be true when you look at the rural education research. Rural high school students tend to have higher graduation rates than urban high school students. But for some reason, we're still not going to college, right? And those are the issues that I'm interested in. And the public high school that I connected with in Fillmore mirrored these demographics, right, of the larger community. 95% of the student body there are Latinx. They have about 1,000 students, so the smaller high school. 75% receive free and reduced lunches, right? So even though they might not be in poverty, they clearly are still needing financial resources, which, as we know, is being attacked under the Trump administration. And 95% of students graduate high school. Again, we see these trends of really high graduation rates in this high school, but only about half of them meet the eligibility to attend a four-year public university in our state, like a CSU or a UC. And so I find that to be deeply troubling, because it means that students in these communities in this high school, right, have limited options in terms of where they can go to pursue higher education, right? And especially for someone like me, I believe that I wouldn't be here as an assistant professor had I not gone to a place like UCLA and learned about research, and that I can do research on issues that I deeply care about. So there is not one right institution to go to, but students need to know about the different institutions that there are and have access to these different types and not be solely funneled into one type of institution. And so the questions that I proposed under this AAHHE Postdoctoral Fellowship project is thinking about geographic and socio-political context, which is incredibly timely given everything that we've been seeing on the news that's happening under the Trump administration, and thinking about how is that shaping students' higher education access, their choices, their opportunities, and of course their social mobility, right, and their ability to continue on to the next generation. And how do these students understand choice, right? How are they thinking about their higher education options when they are living in under-resourced communities, they're geographically isolated from public higher education institutions, they're attending under-resourced high schools, right? So how do all of these things affect what a student perceives is a possibility for them? And so the design that I proposed for this project is a mixed method study in which I'm collecting both qualitative and quantitative data. And because of my positionality and identity as a Mexican-American woman, I also employ a lot of Chicana feminist methodologies. thinking about the ways that I'm forming relationships with schools and communities, and how am I doing that ethically, how am I doing that in a way that really honors the students and the communities that I work with. And so I draw a lot on feminist principles of doing research to make sure that I'm holding myself accountable to the communities and the students that I work with. And so during the summer when I first got the fellowship, it was a lot about developing these relationships, right, and gaining the trust of the students, the high school counselors, the school district, and meeting with community members, because as I mentioned, right, they're not used to having a researcher in their schools and their classroom, because UCSB faculty don't normally do outreach to these communities. And so it was a lot of answering, why are you here? What do you want with our students? And what are you doing, right? And when I did my dissertation research in the San Joaquin Valley, I didn't get that same resistance, even though they are also not used to having researchers there. The only UC that we have in the San Joaquin Valley is UC Merced, right? But because I was from that community, I was from that region, I had relationships with students and different school districts. Because of that work that I did with the Central Valley Project, they were a lot more welcoming of me. But now being a new assistant professor, and again, them not being familiar with what is research and what is the purpose of this, there was a lot of questions that I had to answer. And that was also really nice to be questioned in that way, right? Because we do need to be critical of who we let into these schools and these communities, and what are people's intentions with the students and the families there. Because they are already a marginalized, vulnerable population, right? And then this past fall, so this is what I just finished up in December, I was conducting observations and field notes, and I employed this critical race Nepalera methodology, which I'll talk about shortly. And now what I'm doing is I'm beginning that student recruitment now that I've developed those relationships with students, and my goal is to hopefully recruit 10 to 15 that are from these rural migrant farm working backgrounds or working class backgrounds that have a Latinx identity. They're high school seniors, they're applying or have already applied to college, and their intent is to go into higher education in the fall, in the August, and who are first generation college students. And then the next phase is this other methodology that I'm employing, platicando y mapeando, or talking and mapping. And this is a methodology that I co-developed that I will also talk about next. So the observations and the field notes, which is the first phase of data collection that I concluded in December, I completed about over 50 hours of observations of being continuously present at the high school site and writing hundreds of pages of field notes of what I had seen, what I had observed, and my own kind of reflections and critiques as well of what I was seeing there. And some of the things that I observed were the college application workshops that were led by the high school counselors there. They also led financial aid workshops for the students. And if you hadn't heard, right, they did this like complete new FAFSA system that is troubling a lot of high school counselors as well, right, because they're having to learn this new way of completing the FAFSA application, and they had launched it and then taken it back, and so it's been a difficult transition, definitely, for students applying to higher education and counselors who are supporting them. I also attended a lot of workshops in which college recruiters came onto the high school campus to recruit students for their specific universities, and it was also very interesting and telling to see what were the universities that were, and colleges, right, that were coming to this campus of primarily low-income Latinx students. There was a lot of out-of-state universities trying to take our students from our state, and a lot of community colleges, a lot of trade schools, and of course our local CSUs, right, like Channel Islands and Northridge did do outreach to this high school, which they should be doing, right, because they are the nearby CSUs, but not a lot of outreach from the UC system, right? And me being a UCSB professor, I was able to talk to students about different UCs and UCSB in particular, but it made me question, why do we not have selective universities going into this high school to try to recruit these students? And yeah, as I mentioned, right, local community colleges like Ventura College and CSU Channel Islands, because of their relationships and partnerships with this high school and the school district in general, did do a lot of workshops for these students, right? So they talked to them about financial aid, about scholarships, they helped them apply to these institutions. So that was really great to see those outreach efforts from these schools that are supposed to be serving these school districts. And so, as I mentioned, right, I'm constantly thinking about my identity, my positionality, and now being a professor, the power that I have, right, the authority that I have, the way that students perceive me as this authority figure, even though we share the same identities, the same backgrounds, the same struggles in applying to higher education. I was once in their position, which is what is motivating me to do this type of research. And so as I was looking through the higher education research, I wanted to implement a methodology, a way of conducting research, as I said, that is accountable to students and to families and to the communities. And I stumbled upon critical race methodology by Dr. Nancy Acevedo-Gil, who's a professor at CSU San Bernardino. And she essentially merges these ways of viewing the world, like critical race theory, which we've also heard a lot, but from a negative standpoint from the Trump administration, right? But essentially is we want to dismantle racial inequalities as well as other systems of oppression that marginalize women, disabled folks, right? And so that's one theory that Acevedo-Gil draws on. And the second theory is Chicana feminism, right? Which is a way of viewing the world in which we're always thinking about our relationship to white women as women of color, right? And also to men as women. And this Atleta stage here in the middle is just also thinking about, for me, for example, being a Mexican American woman, thinking about my Mexican culture, my American culture, and how I'm constantly straddling both, and that in-between sort of liminal space and stage that it places me in. And Dr. Acevedo-Gil also talks about, again, what does it mean when we're doing research with communities that share our identities, right? So what does it mean for me to be in this Fillmore community and Fillmore High School as I'm doing research with students that are also Latinx, also first generation, also working class, also from these migrant farm working backgrounds, and how do I situate myself within being a researcher, but also wanting to be an advocate and also wanting to help them, right? And wanting to be their ally. And so at the core of this feminist methodology or way of doing research, Acevedo-Gil says that it is our responsibility as higher education researchers who are researching inequalities, right, to connect our participants with resources. So as I'm documenting and making sense of the different inequalities that impact the students' decision to go into higher education, how am I also intervening in helping this student and providing them with advice or with resources, with information, with guidance, rather than sort of waiting until the end that I finish my study and then writing up a policy implication paper or practical recommendations paper, which is often what agencies or organizations that fund my work ask me to do. Like, okay, just write me 3 to 5 recommendations based on what you read. And so as I'm witnessing inequalities, I don't want to wait until the end of the study when I can help the students and their families now and make a difference now, right? So that's really at the core of this methodology and developing these reciprocal relationships with students, because I obviously, as a researcher, benefit a lot, right, from doing this study, doing these observations, analyzing the data, talking with students, right? It's going to help me get grants, it's gonna help me with tenure at UCSB, right? So what am I also doing for the families and the students that are experiencing these higher education inequities? And ultimately, Acevedo Gil argues through this methodology that helping the students in real time as they're making these decisions about higher education access will make that data richer, because now they trust you, they know that you are an ally, right? That you all have a mutual interest in that student's success and well-being. So it's really a strength, right, to approach research from this reciprocal stance. And some examples quickly is, I helped a lot of students research in different colleges and majors and asking them what they wanted to do, right, in terms of career paths and how that would align with their majors. Helping students complete their applications, I would say sometimes 2-3 hours after school, just trying to troubleshoot, as well as with financial aid. As I mentioned, there were so many challenges that we had with this new system. I would share my own experiences, right, of going to 3 different UCs and now being at UCSB and how that could benefit maybe schools that they were not considering, but they are eligible for. Providing them with feedback on their college essays and scholarship essays, right? I really want them to get into higher education. I really want them to secure financial resources as well. And then just going through the financial aid application workshops with them. And I would also help parents, because now with this new system, not only does the student need to have a FAFSA account, but parents also need to create one, which is just really a difficult process when also you're working with parents, right, who don't speak English, who are not tech savvy, and yeah, all of those challenges that language barriers and tech inaccessibility pose. And I would often work with parents as well on them completing their own FAFSA applications to support their students' FAFSAs. And so far, as I mentioned, I just finished this in December, doing the 50 hours of observations and the hundreds of pages of field notes. I've begun to start to analyze this data, but I don't anticipate finishing until the end of the fellowship in the summer. But so far, right, what I'm seeing from the observations is that as I've been helping students think about which colleges they want to go to, what majors they want to apply under, and what career paths they're thinking about, for many of them it's their senior year, and they're barely starting to think about these things that are major life decisions, right? And so that's one thing that I've been really reflecting on, is that we can't have a student thinking about which institutions they want to go to and what do they want to do with the rest of their life at the time of application. And there are some students that have started to think about this at least like the summer before their high school year, and I've been noticing that the students that did do that, like at the end of their junior year, have been a lot more successful in sort of the college application process. But really great, we all know that we need to be talking to students from a very young age about higher education and figuring out what they want to do and how we can support them doing that. And we were just talking about the STEM camp for young girls who are in middle school, and those are perfect examples of what we could be doing to get students to think about their passions, their purpose, and what they want to do in life, so that when they are high school seniors, they're not sitting there staring at the screen wondering, well, I don't even know what I want to do, right? And a lot of these students as well, many of them have familial responsibilities. A lot of the times it precluded them from participating in like extracurricular activities, right? Because many of them have to go home to help out at home or care for younger siblings, which was my experience as well as a high school student. And so oftentimes they had difficulty communicating their experiences on the college essays. Like for example, with the UC system, right, we have the personal insight questions where you have to choose 4 questions from a list of 8 to respond to. And so sometimes the students wouldn't see themselves as leaders, even though they were describing all of the leadership that they do in their homes and their families and their communities, but because it wasn't a club, right, they thought that that wasn't leadership. Or even, for example, students talking about just their average day, and sometimes right on the weekends if they would go into the agricultural fields to help their parents pick the crops, that was just like a completely normal day to them. And I'm like, you know, the average high school student, average young person going to college is not doing that from 5 to 5, and that is something you need to talk about in your college applications, because that's going to help you stand out And so just talking with students, right, and helping them brainstorm ways that their lives and their identities are unique and how those things are assets that will help them have a strong college admissions profile. Also, the benefits, right, of having those college recruiters that would come into this high school. I was surprised by the amount of outside resources that this high school had access to. And so for the college recruiters that would come, for example, we had some from the University of Washington who came and did a presentation. A lot of our students applied to that school. And I think for these rural, tight-knit, small communities, right, they need somebody in person to them, connecting with them, sharing about the campus. It's not enough for them to just research the different colleges. They really want that one-to-one experience and relationship. And the high school as well would take the students on field trips. So of course UCSB, I believe they did Irvine and Long Beach, and a lot of the students applied to those schools, right? Just having a little familiarity with them really motivated them to apply to these institutions. And these college application workshops also that I observed that were led by the high school counselors. So sometimes they did it before school, sometimes during school, sometimes after school. So we had so many slots and options to work with different students' schedules. And as being an observer there, one of the powerful things that I noticed was just having that physical space that a student could just walk into and say, okay, this is the time that I'm going to work on my college application, even if it's just for the next 30 minutes before I have to get home and do whatever familial home responsibilities they had there, right? So just having that physical space and having the support of 2 to 3 counselors who were in that room, as well as myself, and the peers also supporting each other, right? I think that was one of the most powerful things that I witnessed as well, that if one student was a little bit further ahead in their college application, they would turn to the other student and help them as well. So it was really this like peer relationships. I think that also facilitated students' access. So this is what I have so far, what I've done so far, and here's where I'm going to go starting, well, it's starting now. It started last week. So the second phase is this methodology that I developed that actually came out of my dissertation research. That I'm now hoping to implement in this new project and see how this methodology holds with students that are from this different region and different community. It's called Platicando y Mapeando, or talking and mapping. So it's this mixed methods methodology that combines a form of qualitative data called pláticas, or conversations, so it translates to conversations. And it also combines things like geographic information systems, which is a software and a tool to create maps by using secondary quantitative data, such as data from the US Census. So it combines this qualitative conversation component with the students with secondary data that exists right by our federal and state government. And the power of doing conversations as opposed to structured interviews, right, which is typically the method that researchers, especially in education, tend to rely on, is that we are positioning students, right, who I'm asking to be a part of the study as collaborators, as equal holders of knowledge, right? Because they are the ones that are sharing their experiences with me, and they know their experiences and their lives best, right? So we need to really think of them as assets to the research process. And this approach to this qualitative research also asks us to make connections between everyday lived experiences and the research inquiry. Usually as researchers, right, we have a set of questions and things that we want to get, and sometimes that could be very extractive and colonial and transactional, but really like what is happening in the young people's lives right now, and how do I also make that a part of the research process, which is a different way, right, to also be really engaging. It provides us potential space for healing, and I'll show an example of that. And then it forces us as the researchers, right, to also be vulnerable and reciprocal with students, sort of like the different examples that I mentioned where I'm also there with the students applying, helping them apply to colleges, sharing information and resources to the best of my ability. And Latinx or conversations is sort of this everyday form of talk that already exists within the Latinx community, right? We often say, hay que tener una plática, let's have a conversation. And researchers, feminist researchers in particular, have taken something that we know to be common or normal, part of our everyday lives in Latinx communities, and made it this whole methodology, right? That way, it feels more familiar to Latinx students and families when we go into these communities to conduct research, and it's not this weird, let's sit in this office, sterile environment, and I'm just asking you questions and you feel uncomfortable and you potentially might not be answering the questions to the best of your ability because of the unfamiliarity of doing research. And so to provide a little bit of context to the importance of Latinx, or this conversational back and forth methodology, I just started them last week, as I mentioned. And of course, right, I have my research questions in which I'm interested in understanding issues of geography and the socio-political context at this time and how that's impacting students' higher education resources, opportunities, what they perceive is possible for students like them from their backgrounds. So I have questions that I write, of course, that I have in mind that I want to ask, but through this conversational Latinx methodology, it also forces us to say, well, what do students want to share with us as researchers? What do they think is important to share with us? And that's a different way of approaching research, right? And so I'm having this Zoom conversation with one of the students, and as soon as she jumps on the call, she's like, and of course, I've been establishing my relationship with her by doing the 50 hours of observations and helping them on their college applications, right? And this student in particular, who we'll call Laura as a pseudonym, is an undocumented student. And so the high school counselors at the site were unfamiliar with the California Dream Act, and so I'm also unfamiliar, right, because I am privileged to be a US citizen and I did the FAFSA application, but I had to do my own research and understand, like, what does Laura need to do to apply for the California Dream Act and how can I help her? So I worked with Laura intimately, which I think shaped, right, how she entered into the conversation that we had via Zoom, where she was like, guess what happened just yesterday? And I was like, what happened? Tell me. And she started talking about the protests that happened in Fillmore and in surrounding communities like Oxnard, and that have been happening right throughout California. In LA, where I'm currently living, right, they blocked the 101 freeway for some time, right? And so there's a lot of activism and awareness around these issues that are impacting a lot of families and communities who are undocumented, immigrant, Latinx. And Laura starts talking about this protest and how she had never seen anything like this before in her community, and how she felt so inspired, and that this was exactly a reason why she wanted to go into higher education. Because she specifically said she wanted to prove to people like Trump, right, that Mexicans were not just criminals and drug dealers and everything that he has said since his 2016 run for president. She wanted to prove to him, to people like him who have these beliefs, right, obviously deficit, racist beliefs about Mexican people, that she was not like that and her community was not like that. And so we talked about this protest and the impact that it had on her higher education journey for the first 30 minutes of our conversation. And it was something that she really wanted to get off her chest and share with me, right? And so that's just one example about the importance of this conversational nature, where we're allowing the students and their lived experiences and their knowledge to sort of take center stage in the research process, because it teaches us a lot about what young people care about in this particular moment, right? And so just to give a little bit more context on this first conversation that I had with Laura, she would be someone who's classified as an achiever by rural scholars, by rural education scholars, because she applied to 13 colleges, right, which is amazing. And we see that she applied to a diversity of institutions, including community colleges, CSUs, UCs, and even private institutions like Pepperdine, Cal Lutheran, and USC. And as I have been thinking about this conversation that I had with Laura, right, one of the things that I'm interested in understanding more is why she chose the different schools that she did, right? And for her, some of them she did say, I applied to them just as a backup in case I don't get into my top choices, right? Others she did apply because she had visited those schools with her high school. So again, the importance of taking students, right, to tour these universities and exposing them to universities that they might not have had access to otherwise. And other times, because of the nature of these rural small town communities where things like kinship are really important, some of the institutions she applied to was also because she knew people that were going there. Her friends or alumni from her high school had gone there, right? And we see how such a major life decision about where you want to go for higher education is influenced a lot by sort of the culture and geographical factors, right, and backgrounds of these students. And it was interesting to me, right, so we classify her as an achiever because she obviously has amazing grades and she applied to all of these institutions, but also because achievers are those students who tend to leave the rural and small town communities and unfortunately don't come back, right? Because then it's hard to come back and try to get access to a profession that requires a college degree when we know that a lot of rural and small towns don't rely on economies and industries that need higher education professionals, right, unfortunately. And so Laura talked about wanting to leave her community for college, but interestingly, she wanted to go to an institution that would feel like her hometown, that would be small like her hometown. And so some of the schools that she was looking at was like Chico, UC Davis, Cal Poly SLO, because they felt like agricultural, they felt small to her. So that was really interesting to me that she wants to leave this community of Fillmore, but where she goes, she still wants it to be like Fillmore. And this is a second conversation that I had with student Maria, also a pseudonym, and she would be also classified as this achiever, but also a seeker. And she applied to 21 schools, a diversity of institutional types as well, and half of the schools that she applied to were out-of-state public universities. And it was interesting with Maria, she was someone who was an AVID since she was a 6th grader. And we know AVID, right, is this college prep program for low-income and first-generation college students. And so we really see the positive impact of these college readiness programs on students like Maria, who are the first in their families to go into higher education. And so since she was a 6th grader, she said she would just research colleges at home. How amazing is that, right? Being the first in your family, the oldest daughter, being 12 years old, thinking about higher education. That was not my trajectory. I was one of those students that was thinking about higher education as I was applying. And she also talked about the huge influence that those college recruiters that came to her high school campus had, right? And also just institutions that would provide her with fee waivers, right? So that she could apply there because she was a working class, low income student or had received emails from these colleges or institutions that her friends or teachers would recommend, right? Again, this nature of these rural, small town communities in which once you have trust with an individual, you really take what they say. It really matters what they say, right? The institutions that teachers, friends, or even some that I would suggest to her that she might consider, she added them to her college applications. And so Maria is also someone who's an achiever, right? She also wants to leave her community, but she is also a seeker, and this is like another type of student that exists in these rural, small town communities, because she does want to go to a higher education institution that's far away, and that is drastically different from her community of Fillmore, which contrasts with student Laura, right? And we talked about that. Why is that you want to leave somewhere where you have lived for 18 years, because she talked very fondly of her community of Fillmore and everything that I had done for her, and that I had raised her to be the person that she was. And so she had all these, all of her values and ethics and way of life, right, was tied to being raised in this community. And so I couldn't understand, right, why is it that you want to leave somewhere that you love so much then, right, and that you care about the people here, and that you're worried for the people here. And she mentioned, again, everything that's happening now under the Trump administration, right, and she mentioned that these small town communities, and I can also attest to that from being from Porterville, where it's a community that is also Latinx and white. White is the second largest demographic group in my community. And if you drive through the San Joaquin Valley, there's a lot of Trump signs, there's a lot of like anti-immigrant signs, right? And so this was something that Maria talked about. She's like, I'm not sure if I want to live here in Fillmore if they have anti-immigrant conservative policies and politics. She's like, I would rather go and live in a large urban city that I know is going to be more diverse in terms of people and perspectives and politics. And so that was her reasoning, right, for wanting to live in a more progressive and liberal community and travel further away for college. And so this is the pláticas, the conversations that I'm having with students are happening now. And once I wrap this up, sort of the next part is to do the second part of this talking and mapping methodology that I developed, in which I'll be looking at those conversations and starting to identify those barriers, those challenges, the reasons that students do or do not apply to higher education and why that is, and what's impacting their higher education access and choices. And then I'll look at quantitative secondary data, right, because we have a lot of really good data in the census and the California Department of Education, to look for those reasons that students are talking about. So one of the big ones as well, right, is income. And so taking these types of variables from places like the US Census and then uploading them into this GIS software that will allow me to map and to visualize the inequities that students with these identities from these communities are facing, to sort of have a portrait of what are those biggest inequities that are impacting students. And the most important part of this sort of mapping higher education inequities to me is that I then take these maps back to the students and ask them to reflect on what they're seeing and how what they're seeing from secondary data, right, that is collected by our government matches or does not match their own lived experiences and realities. Because oftentimes, right, what we know from the census is that it collects very generalized data on our communities and it is not very nuanced, right? And so this is a way to really nuance secondary data that's collected of our communities and how we can make maps, secondary data, GIS, quantitative data more humanized, more nuanced, more complex by infusing the lived experiences and critiques of students onto those maps. And then the final conversation that I plan to have in May is when students submit their intent to register at a college, right, which normally happens May 1st, and to then delve into a conversation with these students about why they selected the institution that they selected, right? Because somebody like Laura right now is saying, I do want to go far away, and someone like Maria too is saying, I want to go far away, but as we get closer and closer, things become a lot more real, right? As we have to make these decisions about, am I actually going to travel? For Laura, for example, who's referencing Chico State right now as her dream school, is she actually going to travel 6 hours away to get to this institution? And she may, or she may not, right? And so I'm really curious about how our understanding of choice, students' understanding of choice, changes over time, even in such a short period from when I began the conversations last week to the end of May. And then also talking about those majors, right? What is influencing what they want to do. A lot of the students that have signed up for the study that I have not spoken to with, but have the conversations scheduled, want to be immigration attorneys. And we can probably already imagine why that is, right? Other students want to be diplomats and want to be in politics. And so a lot, I think, is what's happening in our communities, in the state and the nation, is really influencing those trajectories of those students, right? And so to end, because now I've been talking for an hour, and I was told 30 minutes. I want to end by just sharing a little bit of the ways that I'm disseminating this work as I'm collecting the work. So one is by presenting at conferences, right? Getting this work out there to different folks. So I submitted a proposal to the Critical Race Studies and Education Conference that is examining the recruitment of these out-of-state universities, because it's so interesting to me that places like Alabama, Louisiana are coming to the small town community of Fillmore and asking students to apply there. And as I've mentioned, right, I've been going to these workshops and sitting there in the corner observing what these recruiters are saying to students, and it's really interesting to hear these recruiters who don't have connections to the communities, the students, or the families there, telling the students that, yeah, you need to leave because this community doesn't have anything to offer you. So it's coming from this very negative deficit perspective, and again, students take what they're saying from these recruiters, they highly regard what they're saying, right, because they perceive them as these authority figures. And so if these college personnel, college recruiters are telling you that your community is worthless, it doesn't have anything to offer you, you need to leave, how are young people understanding that, right? Which, when my teachers and counselors were pushing me to go to UCLA, because I was one of 2 students in my high school that had gone in, it was also coming from that perspective of them saying that I was more than my parents, right? And that can be very conflicting and troubling when everything that I feel like I've done so far is because of the sacrifices that my parents have made for me to be a US citizen, to have access to higher education that they did not have access to, right? So it's just like the different messaging that students have been receiving, and I'm interested to understand how students are internalizing or rejecting or just interpreting that information from these outside people. And the second is there's a special issue in this journal, the Rural Educator, which is one of the top journals in the field of rural education. And from this relationship that I've been developing with this community, these students, this high school, I submitted an abstract to think about this methodology that I employed, right, and how it is facilitating care and research accountability and responsibility to these communities. So it's more about my own reflections as a researcher doing this type of work and how it could affect other researchers interested in connecting with rural Latinx communities. And then lastly, I was just selected to be one of the faculty that was chosen for this new initiative and fellowship at UCSB called the Public Voices Fellow. And so this fellowship selects, I think there's 20 faculty this year that have been selected, and they'll essentially train us to write op-eds, which is a different way of disseminating our research, right? And I think for me in this project, it's really timely that I'm able to not just write journal articles and research-based way of writing, but also how can I just speak to the general public about the issues that I'm seeing, the issues that young people in these communities are experiencing. And so part of being a fellow is that they will require us to write 3 op-eds. And so I start this fellowship next month, and so it just coincided perfectly with me being a part of this fellowship, and I'll be writing these op-eds, and of course happy to share with AAHHE once they're out to disseminate the work. But this is what I've been doing so far, and I'm just really honored again, as I mentioned, to be one of the recipients, and thank you so much for letting me serve as your guest speaker and connecting with you for the wonderful breakfast and just learning about you all. Thank you so much, I really appreciate it.
will we be able to access the results of your research?
Yes, I'm happy to, whether it's in the form of like journal research articles, happy to send those out, but I can also prepare some kind of report if that would be helpful, more so with like the numbers and the data, or whatever AAUW needs.
Okay, yeah, the journals would be fine.
Okay, yes, definitely. Yes.
I had a question about, are you having these conversations with the students that are not technically prepared? I know in our community in Santa Maria, there's been a big issue about the number of students that are not tracked for college. They're not told to take these AP classes to go to college. Is any of the work you're doing addressing those students, or is that maybe like the next step?
That's a very good question. So the examples obviously that I gave of Laura and Maria, we see that they're high achieving students and they've had access to a lot of college related resources, including AVID. And that's actually something that I've been working to troubleshoot with the high school counselor, because that was something that I shared with them that I also want to learn from the students that are not accessing college resources, and why is that? And so he's been working to disseminate my study and the flyer and the recruitment email with other students that have not been receiving these services or attending these college workshops. And I have a couple of students that have signed up already, and it is interesting to see somebody like Maria applying to 21 schools, and we have another student that was not receiving enough support, and he applied to preschools, right? So we can already see the disparity happening there. Yes?
You mentioned AVID, and my husband had been very involved in the AVID programs here in Santa Barbara County and Ventura and San Luis Obispo. And I was interested in, you mentioned that one of your interviewees was an AVID student. How many of your interviewees are AVID students, and how did you determine to include them in your research or not, except, you know where I'm going?
Yes. So the students that have been right now signing up for my study have mostly been those students that have seen me attending the college application workshops, that I've worked with them one-on-one, hands-on. Those tend to be the students who are like, oh yeah, I know her, I remember her, let me sign up. And then I start to ask students when they sign up, like, aside from these workshops put on by your counselor, are you an AVID, or what are the other types of college-related resources or programs that you're a part of that you have received? Some students, for example, are in the Upward Bound program with Cal Lutheran. And I do notice that those students tend to have the profile like Maria, where they're applying to more institutions and they're considered like to be more of a competitive, highly selective student. And so similar to my response is that I have asked that counselor to send me a list of students that only go to the college workshops versus the students that are also in AVID versus the students that are also in Upward Bound. So I'm trying to have a mix of different types of students, just so I can see the different impact that all these resources or lack thereof have on the students. So I have some students that are signed up already, but I've been in contact with the counselor to say we need more diversity of the types of students that are wanting to participate in this study. And I am offering a $100 gift card to be a part of this study, so that's been helping as well. Yeah. And I was an AVID myself when I was in high school. I received the Dell Scholarship for being an AVID student, and it funded most of my UCLA undergraduate experience.
I have a niece that graduated from Porterville.
Oh, beautiful.
Okay. Sandy, if you had, she had her hand up.
Oh, I don't remember what I was gonna ask you. Oh, 47% in that one slide who weren't eligible to go on to higher education. Do you think a lot of them maybe did voc ed or something like that instead of college prep?
Yeah, so I was actually working with one student during the college application workshops. I was helping him apply. I was like, first let's start your CSU application, right? And as we were completing his CSU application, we came to realize that he was not A through G eligible. He was missing like a history class that he needed. And so in my mind, right, I'm sitting there, how did this happen to this student?
Yeah.
Where was
Yeah.
his counselor? Why did they not
Yes.
intervene? And so then I had to troubleshoot, I had to explain that to the student, right? You actually cannot apply to CSUs
Yeah.
because you're missing this one class. Are you interested in knowing what you can do to make up that class? And he was like, yes. So we found this online history class that he could take that would count towards that credit, and he completed that class in like 2 weeks.
Wow.
And so just a quick Google search made all the difference in
Yeah.
him being eligible or not, but those are also recommendations that I'm thinking, because the high school counselors want recommendations from me that I've been involved with them, and so that is something that I'm thinking, like, how do we have these touch points with students so that it's not until their senior year that we learn, oh, he's not eligible to attend. We need to know that a lot sooner so that students have opportunities to make up those classes if they are missing them.
Right, okay.
Yeah, sorry to see.
He did.
He did, he was, okay, sorry. The law has.
So the thing that I'm curious about is, how do you see the role of community colleges with dual enrollment in high school, especially in, schools of students of color?
Right.
And the fact that, many of the places that you're talking about, there isn't a community college nearby.
Right.
It does seem like that is a really good option. And it should become policy that really dual enrollment at high schools, operate at every high school, because then there's a cost side of it in terms of what the student may face down the road.
Exactly, yeah.
Higher chance of going to a straight 4-year out of college, out of high school, or the fact that community colleges just give a bad reputation
Right.
because they're sort of looked at as not real college,
Right.
and that's not the case. I'm very involved with Hancock College, and we know what we're trying to do
Yeah.
there. Do you see that as something that out of your research could be something put on the table to come back and say more role of community colleges and how this would impact students of color and advance them? Because again, being with Hancock, I read a lot of scholarship applications, and I read the application and I go, I don't care what color this person is, I want them in this country. I want them to be part of our society because they all want to contribute.
Yeah.
And that's what we want, right? That's how we build our future. So do you see that as something in your research eventually maybe you'd sort of look at and what that impact would be, and would more students attend once they have that opportunity to get those classes in high school?
Yeah.
Because they're seeing what that could lead for them. You take a senior in high school and take them down to UCLA, unless they're already prepared to go there from the 8th grade,
Right.
there's really not a lot of opportunity. When we do that, we make sure that you talk about how do you transfer here? How do I transfer here after maybe 2 years or 1 year of college? But it just seems like the further we can get that embedded into the high school curriculum, the more results we actually have. And that includes vocational training. I mean, that's all there. But it just seems like it's a component that needs to be more policy oriented.
Right.
That this is what we do. This is our educational system based on, this is how this goes in high school, you have these opportunities, and then that would be more equal in a lot of respects.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great question. So one of the workshops that I did observe was from Ventura College, which is sort of the community college that students from this high school would funnel into if they chose the community college route. And Ventura College is very active on this high school campus, as they should be, and they would come and give dual enrollment workshops. And it was interesting because I would talk to the students like during these workshops, like, why are you enrolling in these community college classes? What do you think about them? And often the students would say, these classes are a lot easier than my high school classes because the professors give me a syllabus, I know what to expect. Right, it's a lot more structured than maybe in a high school space where maybe the teachers are coming up with the lessons as they go. And so it really motivated the students to see that higher education was a possibility, and it wasn't that difficult so long as they worked hard and tried hard and got access to the resources. And so a lot of the students that have been signing up for my study are dually enrolled in Ventura College, and they would also learn just logistically that they have access to multiple community colleges within the single district. So they would also enroll in Moore Park College or Oxnard College and take classes online and not have to commute. And so a lot of the students saw the benefits of doing that. And it just made college seem a lot easier for them and doable. So it's definitely something that I've been thinking about too, because I think the presence of Ventura College and them constantly going to recruit students for dual enrollment is really influencing and creating this culture of college accessibility and opportunity that probably wouldn't have been
Becomes the norm.
otherwise. Exactly,
Becomes the norm,
exactly.
yeah.
Everybody's gonna enroll in this math community college
Right.
class, yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to throw something else on your plate.
No, which I think, yeah, that's why I love doing research, because then you just see different strands of work coming out of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Or,
I'll waive mine. Mine was community college based too. A little bit different than Tim's, but I think you addressed it.
Yeah, I just was struck by the concept of the mapping, because on the face of it, mapping is I guess you could say almost two-dimensional. But I also heard in your talk kind of the three-dimensionality of it, because it's not only distance, but it's also access to information.
right,
And so one question I had is, what role does the availability of the internet, of electronic
Yeah.
devices, of Zoom classrooms, what role can that play in shortening the distance?
yeah, that's a really great question, and something that I've been thinking about a lot, because actually when I conducted my dissertation research in the San Joaquin Valley, also with students from these backgrounds, it was during COVID. And so my whole study ended up being Zoom and remote outreach and remote recruitment, and the students were doing online classes. And I wrote an article on that, because as I was talking to the students about their higher education opportunities during that time, many of them did not have access to the internet. And in somewhere like East Porterville, where we're this unincorporated community towards the mountains, our internet, our Wi-Fi there is very spotty and very difficult, and few internet companies service communities such as these because they think it's not worth it because it's underpopulated and right. And so the students would talk about the difficulties of having access to internet, and many of them don't own their own personal devices, computers. And a year before I had conducted that study, our library, our public library in my hometown of East Porterville had burned down due to arson. And so a place that would normally provide internet, computers, students didn't have access to that. So it was like all these compounding issues were happening all at once to impact higher education opportunity. And all that to say is that as students were still taking, and there are some higher education researchers that think about online colleges and, trying to power, just connection and connecting students that are geographically isolated to higher education classes and institutions. But what I saw, at least at the high school level, when students were taking their Zoom classes, is just the lack of quality of education, right? And so I think I'm skeptical of that until we know that we can for sure provide access to technology, computers, the internet, until that infrastructure is there. And then also once we have teachers or professors that are trained in actually teaching online, right? Because when COVID hit, the university just expected us to know how to teach online. And so that was very difficult, right? And the students talked about just being disengaged. And also I think within the context of a rural community, the students thrive off having that in-person connection to their teachers and their counselors and their peers. They see that as a great source of motivation. And so I think that it definitely can increase access in higher education, but also like what are the trade-offs in terms of building this community of support, in terms of having high quality education, in terms of ensuring that students who are already marginalized and lacking opportunities are not further marginalized by this unequal education system.
In your broader research, how many AVID programs are in the high schools in California? Because I have a friend who's an AVID coordinator, and that seems to be something that, like, if Fillmore has that, then they could follow what you did, what you kind of started and worked on. That would be the carry-on piece.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm not actually sure about how many AVID programs exist in the state of California. But I think something as well that I've been thinking about is the differences in AVID quality as well, right? So not just quantity, but the students here at Fillmore had this really great connection with their AVID teacher, and there's like a particular way that he would talk about going to college in service of your family, of your community, of contributing to the next generation, of contributing to society, becoming leaders, creating political and social change, right? And so that AVID curriculum might be very different from an AVID curriculum elsewhere. And so something that I've been thinking about is just what does AVID curriculum, or what should it look like in small town rural communities in a way that benefits both the student and the community, right? Because a lot of what rural education researchers also talk about is what happens when we do send off our best and our brightest. That sort of contributes to the dwindling of our rural communities and economies, and we also don't want that, right? So it needs to be a balance in terms of sending off our youth so that they have access to opportunity, but also nurturing them to come back, or at least to give back and inspire the next generation, remain connected. But I think an issue is also thinking about quality and curriculum within AVID programs and how they might differ by context, geography, culture, the types of students.
One more question.
Yes.
If there is one more question.
Oh, I have a question. Was there somebody behind me? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, just thank you for the quality of the research that you're doing and things like that. But I also wanted to say how much I appreciated your going back as an undergraduate to try to recruit other people and stuff. And so thinking about your undergraduate years and maybe in your third plática with students as they're, preparing to go to whichever college that they would be going to, do you have some sort of sense of advice that you might give them about, how to navigate, the resources that often aren't there once you get into that setting for, again, kind of connecting back home or, kind of finding, oh my gosh, I need, the computer, I need all these other kinds of things, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's something that I have been thinking about, especially as I just finished this conversation with Maria, and she was someone that said, I don't want to come back, and I just want to be somewhere that's completely different from Fillmore. I was thinking once I wrap up this study in May, and it's my final conversation with her, but as I saw in my dissertation study, the youth that I did my work with back in 2020, I'm still in communication with them. So I'm hoping that something similar happens here with Fillmore, and hopefully that conversation we have in May is not the end. But I have been thinking about what am I going to tell Maria, because she seems to have this idea of I'm going to leave and never come back, but I also want her to think about her responsibility and attachment to this place, and how it is our responsibility to keep the generations here moving forward. So for one, I want to offer this sort of like personal advice and perspective, and then a second thing that I do want to do with like the high school or the counselors is, once we have these young people that go off like Maria, who got admitted into USC, and this is her top school or her dream school, and she thinks she's committed to going there as of right now. We'll check back in May to see if that still is the school. Hopefully it is for her. But now we have somebody from Fillmore at USC, or will have, right? And so how do we create this sort of listserv where the high school counselors now know where their students are going, and we can save this so that the next senior class, if there are students that need a tour at USC or just need a friend, right, a community member, like how do we not forget about the people that left and keep them a part of our community's resources is also something that I'm interested in developing with the high schools. And also just thinking about creating resources for students like Maria, who's going to USC, and me starting to research that college more for her and creating some kind of little resource guide so that when she first gets to USC, it doesn't feel as strange and hopefully feels a little familiar and she knows where the different resources and centers are at.